What up, guys? I'm back with another video. This video right here is going to leave your mouth on the floor. When I tell you this video has so many twists and turns, it's unbelievable. It's about two brothers. Not only are they brothers, but they're twin brothers who have a hell of a secret. Let's get into it. And as you guys know, I am going to give my opinion throughout the video. So stay tuned and let's get to it.
Always been inseparable. Growing up in the crowded streets of Brooklyn, New York, their connection was deeper than most twins, transcending simple brotherly love. To their friends and neighbors, they were two halves of a whole, reflections of each other in everything they did. But beneath that bond was something darker, something they had buried deep for years, until it surfaced in ways that neither could anticipate. From the moment they hit adolescence, the energy between them shifted. It was subtle at first, a lingering touch when they wrestled, an awkward stare when they shared the cramped bathroom of their tiny apartment. Elijah would catch Ethan watching him through the cracked door as he showered, the steam fogging up the mirrors but not enough to obscure the intensity of Ethan's gaze. It was a tension that should have never existed between brothers, but it was there, always lurking just beneath the surface. The final summer before Ethan left for the military, everything changed. It was a hot, sticky night in August. The air conditioning in their small apartment was broken, the heat unbearable. Both twins lay in their shared bedroom, shirtless, their bodies slick with sweat. Outside, the noise of the city continued, but inside, it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Elijah stared at the ceiling, trying to push the thoughts from his mind, the thoughts that had haunted him for months. His twin brother, lying just feet away, had become the focus of desires he couldn't comprehend, desires he desperately tried to resist. Eli, you awake? Ethan's voice was low, cutting through the silence. His bed creaked as he turned to face his brother, the moonlight casting shadows across his muscular frame. Elijah shifted, his heart pounding. He knew where this was going. It had been building up to this moment for months, if not years. Yeah, I'm awake, he replied, his voice shaky, betraying his unease. Ethan didn't say anything at first, just stared at Elijah, his eyes intense, unreadable. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours until finally,
Okay. Now, guys, leave a comment below. What do you think about this so far? I'm actually taken back because how? Why? Would this ever cross anyone's mind? I'm sorry, there's no way in heck that I would think about any of my siblings sexually. This is crazy, but bear with me, guys, and let's get on back to it.
Ethan got up, crossing the small distance between their beds. He sat down on the edge of Elijah's mattress, his proximity sending a wave of heat through Elijah's already tense body. We need to talk, Ethan murmured, though his body language suggested anything but talking. Elijah swallowed hard, his throat dry. He sat up, leaning against the headboard, his legs barely brushing against Ethan's. The contact was electric, the unspoken tension between them suffocating. About what? Ethan's eyes locked onto Elijah's, unblinking, intense. He leaned closer, their faces now just inches apart. You know what? We've been dancing around this for too long. Elijah's stomach twisted with a mix of fear and something darker, something he didn't want to name. Ethan, we're brothers. This, this isn't right. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt weak, hollow. His body was betraying him, his skin tingling at the closeness of Ethan's. He tried to scoot away, but Ethan grabbed his wrist, pulling him back. I don't care, Ethan whispered, his breath hot against Elijah's skin. We're more than that, and you know it. Elijah's mind screamed at him to push Ethan away, to get out of bed and leave, but his body refused to cooperate. Instead, he sat frozen as Ethan's hand slid up his arm, his fingers tracing the outline of his muscles. The touch sent a shiver down Elijah's spine, and despite every ounce of self-control he had, he felt himself leaning into it. Ethan, we can't, Elijah whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of terror and forbidden excitement. Ethan didn't respond with words. Instead, he leaned in further, his lips brushing against Elijah's neck, the contact sending a jolt through Elijah's body. Elijah inhaled sharply, his entire body tensing as Ethan's lips trailed up to his jawline.
Okay, so this is what I'm interested in as well. How old are these brothers? Now, I know you guys see the two gentlemen on the screen, and naturally, you're assuming that we're talking about these two guys. But I'm almost 100% sure these are not the guys we're talking about. But I just want to know, and I'm interested in knowing how old these brothers are.
The kisses were soft at first, tentative, but they quickly became more desperate, more insistent. Stop, please, Elijah whispered, his hands weakly pushing against Ethan's chest. But Ethan didn't stop. He couldn't stop. His hands moved to the back of Elijah's neck, pulling him closer until their lips met in a kiss that was filled with years of pent-up desire, anger, and confusion. It was wrong, and they both knew it, but the wrongness only made it more intoxicating. Elijah's resistance crumbled as Ethan's hands roamed over his body, his touch familiar yet forbidden. His mind screamed at him to stop, but his body betrayed him, responding to every kiss, every touch. The heat between them was unbearable, the air thick with tension. They fell back onto the bed, limbs tangled as their movements grew more frantic, more desperate. Ethan's lips moved down Elijah's chest, his breath hot against his skin, sending shockwaves of pleasure and guilt coursing through Elijah's veins. Elijah tried to push him away again, his hands gripping Ethan's shoulders. This isn't right, Elijah gasped, his breath ragged. But Ethan didn't listen. He pushed harder, his obsession with his twin brother now completely taking over. His hands slid lower, their bodies now pressed together, the intensity between them reaching a fever pitch. At that moment, the outside world ceased to exist. It was just them, locked in their twisted dance, their bodies driven by something primal, something dark. Elijah knew it was wrong, knew they had crossed a line that they could never uncross. But in that moment, he couldn't stop himself. He surrendered. The night passed in a blur of tangled sheets, whispered names, and stolen moments of passion. It was raw, dirty, and filled with shame.
Okay, I'm sorry. I have to come in. I have to stop. Um, the narrator is sending me on this. It's the tenseness of the narration for me. But I'm sorry, this is very disturbing. Like, how? I'm sorry, guys. I like how. When has it become normal for you to lay down with a sibling, a relative of any kind? Like, this is very troublesome. For real, for real. But let's get back to it.
But neither of them could stop. The boundaries between them had shattered, and there was no going back. They were no longer just brothers. They were something else, something dangerous. But as the sun began to rise, the weight of what they had done settled in. Elijah lay beside Ethan, his chest heaving, his mind spinning with guilt and confusion. He couldn't look at Ethan, couldn't face the reality of what they had just done. We can't ever do that again, Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible. His body ached with the aftermath of their passion, but his soul ached even more. Ethan didn't respond. He just stared at the ceiling, his mind already drifting somewhere far darker. In his heart, he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The next morning, Ethan packed his bags and left for the military. Elijah stood in the doorway, watching him go, his stomach twisted in knots. The shame of their night together hung heavy in the air, suffocating them both. I'll see you when I get back, Ethan said, his voice cold, distant. Elijah didn't respond. He simply nodded, his heart heavy with guilt, knowing that their relationship had been forever altered. As Ethan disappeared into the city streets, Elijah felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Part of him hoped that Ethan's time away would make things easier, that the distance would help them forget what had happened. But deep down, he knew that wasn't possible. Ethan wasn't the type to forget. His obsession would only grow stronger with time. And when he returned, Elijah knew they would be forced to confront the darkness between them once again. 5 years passed, but for Elijah Davis, time stood still. Every day was a struggle to keep his mind from drifting back to that fateful summer night with his twin brother. He tried to convince himself that it had been a mistake, that what happened was just a byproduct of their inseparable bond, one that had simply gone too far. But the shame that gnawed at his insides wouldn't let him forget. He buried himself in his work, trying to push the memories down with endless shifts as an EMT in New York. His life became a blur of flashing lights, rushing patients, and the sterile scent of hospitals. When he wasn't at work, he found solace in the arms of different men, fleeting hookups that never lasted more than a night. No one could replace the intensity of what he had shared with Ethan. And in his darkest moments, Elijah hated himself for still longing for that twisted connection. But Ethan had been gone for 5 years, serving in the military, and Elijah had no intention of ever reopening that chapter of his life. As the years went by, he convinced himself that maybe Ethan had moved on, that the military had straightened him out. He had received occasional letters from Ethan, impersonal updates about his training, the places he had been stationed. There was never any mention of what happened between them. It was as if that night had been erased from Ethan's mind. But deep down, Elijah knew better. The obsession that had consumed Ethan couldn't be erased so easily. And when the day finally came for Ethan to return, Elijah felt that old familiar dread creeping back into his chest. Elijah's life had changed, or so he thought. Elijah tried to keep himself distracted as the days led up to Ethan's return. His boyfriend Jason had moved in with him a year ago, and their relationship had grown serious. Jason
Okay, so what I'm interested in knowing is how this dynamic is about to work. For 5 years, one twin has been gone, excuse me. This ain't gonna be perfect, guys, so bear with me. But anyways, one twin has been gone serving in the army or military, excuse me, and the other one has been out pretty much frolicking. Okay, so now, man, this is about to get crazy. I already know how it's about to go down. Let's go, y'all.
was everything Ethan wasn't: stable, kind, loving. They had built a life together, something solid and real, and Elijah was determined to protect it. He hadn't told Jason much about his twin brother, just that Ethan had been away serving in the military and that they hadn't spoken much over the years. Jason didn't ask too many questions, and Elijah was grateful for that. But as the day of Ethan's homecoming grew closer, the old anxieties returned in full force. The nightmares started again. Twisted dreams of that summer night, of Ethan's hands on his body, the heat of their forbidden touch. Elijah would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart racing, Jason asleep beside him, blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing inside. "I'm sure you two will pick up right where you left off," Jason said one night as they lay in bed, his arm draped over Elijah's chest. "He's your brother. I'm sure he's missed you." Elijah forced a smile, but his stomach churned. If Jason only knew what had happened between them, what kind of monster Ethan really was. But how could he ever explain something so dark, so twisted? How could he admit that the man he loved had been replaced by an obsession that haunted him every day? The day Ethan came back, Elijah stood at the doorstep of their childhood home in Brooklyn, waiting. Jason had insisted on coming with him, eager to meet the twin brother Elijah had kept so much of a mystery. Elijah's palms were sweaty as he fidgeted with his phone, glancing down the street every few seconds, waiting for Ethan to appear. Jason noticed his nervousness, placing a comforting hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Hey, it's going to be fine. I'm sure he's excited to see you." Elijah nodded, but his heart was racing. The memories of that night, of Ethan's touch, of the hunger in his brother's eyes flashed through his mind. He had to remind himself that he wasn't the same person he had been 5 years ago. He had moved on. He had a new life. He had Jason. When Ethan finally appeared, stepping out of a cab and walking toward them with his military bag slung over his shoulder, Elijah's stomach dropped. Ethan looked different. He was bigger, more muscular than Elijah remembered, his body hardened by years of training, His face was more rugged, his jawline sharper, but the intensity in his eyes, the darkness that Elijah had tried so hard to forget, was still there, stronger than ever. Elijah, Ethan said, his voice low and gravelly as he approached. His eyes lingered on his twin brother for a moment before.
No, it seems like Ethan is very much so the dominant twin. It seemed like Elijah wasn't really trying to push the relationship. Yes, he had feelings. Yes, he felt a certain type of way towards his brother, but it seemed like Ethan was the aggressor. Ethan was the one that forced and pushed this love triangle or love fetish on his brother. Let's go.
Glancing at Jason. Ethan, this is Jason, Elijah said quickly, trying to keep his voice steady. My boyfriend. For a moment, Ethan's expression remained neutral, but Elijah saw the brief flash of anger in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened as he sized Jason up. Boyfriend, huh? Ethan muttered, his gaze hardening as it flicked between Elijah and Jason. Didn't expect that. Jason extended his hand, smiling warmly. Nice to finally meet you, Ethan. Elijah's told me a lot about you. Ethan shook Jason's hand, but his grip was too firm, too intense. Elijah could see it, the tension building behind Ethan's calm facade, the way his eyes narrowed as he looked at Jason. The moment was brief, but it was enough for Elijah to feel the dread settle deep in his gut. That night, they all went out to dinner, trying to keep things light, but the tension was palpable. Ethan barely said a word, his eyes glued to Elijah the entire time, watching him, studying him. Jason, ever the optimist, kept trying to engage Ethan in conversation, asking him about his time in the military, his future plans. But Ethan's answers were short, clipped. He was focused on one thing and one thing only: Elijah. After dinner, they returned to the apartment Elijah shared with Jason. It was supposed to be a casual evening, but Elijah could feel Ethan's presence like a dark cloud hanging over him. Jason suggested they all watch a movie, trying to make the night as normal as possible. But as the movie played in the background, Elijah could feel Ethan's eyes burning into him, feel the weight of his brother's unspoken obsession crawling back to the surface. I need to get some air, Elijah muttered, standing up from the couch abruptly. Jason looked up, concerned. You okay? I'm fine. Just need a minute. Elijah glanced at Ethan, who had been sitting silently on the other side of the couch. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Elijah saw it. That hunger, that need that had never gone away. He stepped outside into the cool night air, leaning against the railing of their balcony, trying to steady his breathing. But a moment later, Ethan followed him out. Elijah, Ethan said, his voice low as he approached. Elijah tensed, not turning to face him. What do you
Boy, Ethan couldn't wait to get Elijah alone because it seemed like when he pulled up, he was already pissed off. Like, I know this ain't what I think it is. I know this ain't my brother man, aka my man, with another man. This ain't about to be good. So you already know how this about to go. If you don't, you know. But anyways, I also wanted you guys to leave a comment. Who do you think forced this love triangle or this twin on flame? Do you think it was Ethan or do you think it was Elijah? Who was more so the aggressor? Who started this? Leave a comment. Let me know. Let's get back to it.
want, Ethan? Ethan moved closer until he was standing right beside Elijah, too close for comfort. You know what I want, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. It's been 5 years, and nothing's changed. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. He shook his head, trying to control the rising panic. Number, we're not doing this. I'm not doing this. I have a life now. I have Jason. Jason! Ethan spat, the venom in his voice unmistakable. He's not me. He'll never be me. Ethan reached out, his hand brushing against Elijah's arm, the touch electric, just like it had been that night so many years ago. Elijah shuddered, pulling away, but Ethan grabbed him, pulling him close. Stop it, Elijah hissed, his voice trembling. But Ethan didn't stop. His hands gripped Elijah's arms, pulling him closer until their bodies were pressed together. The heat between them was unbearable, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Elijah's mind screamed at him to push Ethan away, but his body betrayed him once again, just like it had all those years ago. Ethan, please, Elijah whispered, his voice breaking as Ethan's lips brushed against his neck, sending a wave of forbidden desire crashing through him. You want this? Ethan growled, his hands gripping tighter as his lips moved up to Elijah's jaw, his breath hot against his skin. You've always wanted this. Elijah's resolve crumbled. He could feel himself giving in, just like before. But this time, it felt different. This time there was no confusion, no hesitation. He knew exactly what this was, a dark, twisted obsession that had consumed Ethan and was now pulling him back into its deadly embrace. Their lips met, the kiss hungry, desperate, filled with years of pent-up emotion. Elijah tried to stop it, tried to push Ethan away, but his body refused to cooperate. His mind was a whirlwind of guilt and desire. But the pull of Ethan's obsession was too strong to resist. As their kiss deepened, Elijah's mind screamed with the knowledge that this wasn't just about lust anymore. This was about control. This was about obsession. And Elijah was trapped in it, unable to break free. They didn't hear Jason come outside. They didn't see him standing there watching them, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. Elijah. Jason's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the moment like a knife. Elijah froze, his heart stopping in his chest. He pulled away from Ethan, his face flushed, his body trembling. Jason stood there, his eyes wide with disbelief, his hands shaking as he stared at the two of them. Elijah, what the hell is this? Jason's voice cracked, raw with emotion. Elijah couldn't speak. The guilt crashed over him like a tidal wave. Jason's face twisted in pain, and before Elijah could say anything, Jason turned and stormed back inside. Jason, wait! Elijah called after him, his voice breaking. But Jason was gone. Elijah turned to Ethan, his chest heaving with a mixture of anger and despair. What have you done? Ethan smirked, the darkness in his eyes flickering with satisfaction. I told you, he'll never be me. Elijah stood there, his body shaking with rage, guilt, and something else. Something darker. The night had turned into a slow-burning nightmare, unraveling everything Elijah had built. Jason's shattered expression haunted him, echoing inside his mind. He had betrayed the one person who gave him a sense of normalcy, a few.
And that's what I'm saying. It seems like Elijah does not want the same thing that Ethan does, but Ethan just doesn't understand that. He thinks because, they had that one night of, sickness. And yeah, they had that one night together that just solidified everything for Elijah, and it didn't. Elijah tried to be as normal as he could within the time frame that Ethan was away, that he actually liked and loved his life, that he was living. And it was almost as so that he put Ethan on the back burner because he didn't have to deal with him, which is why he dreaded him coming home, because he already knew that he was going to try to push this situation on him, knowing that mentally, I mean, logically, physically, that your brother Elijah did not want to be with you in the same way that you wanted to be with him sexually. Let's go.
Future. But it wasn't just Jason's face that haunted him. It was Ethan. The kiss, the touch, the obsession that had always been lurking beneath the surface. It was more than a mistake now. It was a fatal disease that had finally sunk its claws in. Elijah knew he had to find Jason. He couldn't lose him. Not like this. He rushed inside the apartment, his heart pounding in his chest as he called out Jason's name. Jason, please, we need to talk. But the apartment was silent, too silent. Elijah's pulse raced. The feeling of dread crept over him, knowing that something terrible was about to unfold. Elijah found Jason in their bedroom, pacing back and forth, his hands trembling with rage. His eyes were red, tears streaming down his face, but there was something else, an uncontrollable anger. How could you, Elijah? Jason's voice cracked with a rawness that made Elijah wince. How could you do this? With your own brother? Elijah stood frozen in the doorway, guilt crushing his chest like a boulder. Jason, I didn't want this to happen. I was confused, and Ethan, he, don't you dare blame him. Jason's voice was a shout now, vibrating with betrayal. You kissed him! I saw you! Elijah's mouth opened to speak, but he couldn't find the words. How could he explain the pull Ethan had over him? How could he justify something so twisted and wrong? Jason wiped his face, his expression hardening. You're disgusting, Elijah. I can't even look at you. Those words felt like knives digging into Elijah's chest. He stepped closer, but Jason raised his hand to stop him. Don't, Jason whispered, his voice cracking. Just don't. Elijah could feel everything slipping away. The life he had tried to build, the love he had found in Jason, all of it crumbling in the wake of Ethan's obsession. He needed to fix this, to somehow pull Jason back from the edge. I'm so sorry, Jason, Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible. I never wanted this. I swear. Jason shook his head, his jaw clenched. I'm leaving. I can't stay here. Not with you. Not after this. As Jason turned to grab his bag, Elijah felt the weight of finality crashing down on him. Jason wasn't just leaving the apartment, he was leaving him. And it was all because of Ethan. Before Jason could walk out, the front door slammed open, and Ethan strode inside, his eyes wild with something Elijah had seen only once before, uncontrolled fury. He had overheard the argument and knew what was happening. Elijah felt his heart drop as Ethan's eyes locked onto Jason. Where do you think you're going? Ethan's voice was low, dark, vibrating with menace. Jason, his bag slung over his shoulder, took a step back. I'm leaving, Ethan. This is between me and Elijah. You're not part of this. Ethan laughed, a dark, bitter sound that sent a chill down Elijah's spine. Not part of this? Ethan took a step toward Jason, his fists clenched at his sides. I've been part of this long before you ever came into the picture. Elijah belongs to me. Jason's face twisted.
And see, that's what I'm talking about right there. As soon as Ethan got out of the car, he was pissed. He had rage in him before before his shoe even hit the pavement. He was pissed. He felt that his brother chose someone else over him, and he wasn't going to take it regardless if Jason walked in on him and Elijah or not. He wasn't going to deal with Jason being there. So, what I find to be crazy is the fact that now Ethan is ready to, like, Ethan is on go. He's ready to fight Jason. He's ready to do whatever it is that he has to do to win, quote unquote, his man's heart, aka his brother's heart. So it's about to get crazy. Let's finish it up.
In confusion and anger. What the hell are you talking about? He's not your property, Ethan. He's your brother. That's exactly why he's mine, Ethan growled, stepping even closer to Jason, his eyes flashing with dangerous intent. You think you can just walk in and take him away from me? You don't know anything about us. Elijah felt panic rising in his chest. Ethan, stop! Don't do this! But Ethan wasn't listening. His hands shook with barely contained rage. And as Jason stood his ground, something snapped in Ethan's eyes. He lunged at Jason, shoving him hard against the wall, his voice rising into a terrifying growl. You don't get to take him from me, Ethan shouted, his breath hot against Jason's face. You don't get to come between us. Jason struggled to push him off, but Ethan was stronger, his military training evident in the way he held Jason pinned against.
And I'm also not understanding, why is Elijah sitting back listening, watching this happen? Like, Are you not going to step in? Are you not going to tell your brother to, hey, chill out, you have to leave? Like, this is our house. Don't disrespect my boyfriend like that. Like, are you planning on stepping in? Let's go.
The wall. Elijah, help! Jason's voice was filled with desperation, his hands flailing as he tried to fight Ethan off. But Elijah stood frozen, torn between the chaos unfolding in front of him and the memories of everything Ethan had done. He couldn't move. His legs felt like lead as the horror unfolded before him. And then it happened. Ethan's eyes, wild with obsession and rage, locked onto something in the corner of the room. A hammer sitting on the dresser, left there from when they were fixing a broken frame just days earlier. Elijah's stomach dropped. Ethan, don't! Elijah's voice trembled as he watched his brother's hand reach for the hammer. But it was too late. In a blur of motion, Ethan grabbed the hammer, his chest heaving with fury. He raised it high above his head, his eyes filled with a dark, unhinged determination. No! Elijah screamed, but the word barely escaped his lips before the hammer came crashing down. The sound of the impact was sickening. The hammer connected with Jason's head, a dull, wet thud that reverberated through the room. Jason's body crumpled to the ground, blood splattering against the wall, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, time stood still. Elijah's mind couldn't comprehend what had just happened. His legs buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared at the scene in front of him. Ethan stood over Jason's lifeless body, the hammer still clenched in his hand, dripping with blood. His chest heaved with exertion, his eyes wide and wild, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just done. Elijah, Ethan whispered, his voice trembling as he looked down at his twin brother. I did this for us. Now we can finally be together. But all Elijah could see was the blood, Jason's blood, spreading across the floor, pooling around his body, his boyfriend, his future, gone in an instant, and it was all Ethan's fault. Ethan tried to reach out for Elijah, his bloody hand trembling as he stepped toward him. We can be free now, Elijah. Don't you see? He was in the way. He had to go. But Elijah couldn't hear him. His mind was numb, his body shaking with shock and horror. He scrambled to his feet, backing away from Ethan, his heart pounding in his chest. You? You killed him, Elijah choked out, his voice barely a whisper. Ethan's face twisted in confusion. I did it for us. I did it for you. But Elijah couldn't take it anymore. He turned and ran, bolting out of the apartment, stumbling down the stairs, not stopping until he was outside, gasping for breath in the cool night air. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as the neighbors had clearly heard the commotion. Ethan was arrested that night, dragged out of the apartment in handcuffs, covered in Jason's blood. The police found Elijah sitting on the curb outside, numb and silent, unable to process what had just happened. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. Ethan's obsession with Elijah, his military discharge, his violent outburst, all of it painted a picture of a man unhinged, consumed by a dark and twisted love. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Elijah didn't attend the trial. He couldn't bear to see Ethan's face, couldn't bear to relive the horror of that night. Jason was dead, and nothing would ever bring him back. In the years that followed, Elijah struggled to rebuild his life, but the weight of guilt never left him. Jason's death haunted him, the blood-stained memories seeping into every corner of his mind. He couldn't escape the past, couldn't escape the shadow of what Ethan had done. He visited Jason's grave every year on the anniversary of his death, standing in silence, wondering how his life had gone so wrong, wondering if there was ever a way he could have saved Jason from the twisted web of obsession that Ethan had woven around them both.
It was absolutely a way he could have saved Jason's life. He could have intervened. He could have pulled his brother away before he even, picked up the hammer. He could have told him to leave. He could have called the police. He could have threatened to call the police. But there's absolutely definitively a way he could have intervened to save Jason's life. It just was cause for at this point. But let's finish up. We're almost done.
But deep down, Elijah knew the truth. There was no saving Jason. There was no saving himself. Ethan's obsession had destroyed them all, and now he was left with nothing but the ghost of his brother's dark love, haunting him for the rest of his days. Ethan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the brutal murder of Jason. The court determined that his violent obsession with Elijah had led to an unrelenting spiral into madness, culminating in a tragic and senseless act of murder. Elijah, forever marked by the trauma, lived out the rest of his life in the shadow of that bloodstained night, haunted by the darkness that had torn his world apart. Ethan and
So, guys, that's that concludes the video. So, guys, leave a comment. I honestly want to know your opinion when it comes to, the situation at hand. Do you think that there was something that Elijah could have done to save Jason? Do you think that it was something that clicked or snapped in Ethan when he left to go to the military? Do you think it was something maybe that snapped during training? Like, guys, leave your thoughts. To me, like I said, this was very much so preventable, especially when it came to the murder of Jason. But again, guys, thank you for tuning in with me, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Don't forget to like, share, and comment.